Now we are going to be taking a look at SQL fundamentals. So, first of all, before we even get into what SQL means, what it's good for, we're going to look at databases. So, what is a database? A database is simply a structure that information is stored in an organized way so it can be found and used at a later date. So it's basically the digital equivalent of, say, a filing cabinet. And when it comes to databases, they can be anything from Microsoft Access databases as well as information that's gathered and converted from, say, spreadsheets. Now, the structure of a database. What does a database contain? Now, normally it consists of different tables. So a table looks like an individual spreadsheet. So it has columns with labels, and then it has rows which contain the actual data. So, for example, if you have a table of, say, customers, each row would consist of one customer and all their information. So, say their name, email, and phone number would be in the columns. Now, we also have something called a primary key. Now, a primary key is a unique identifier, which makes sure that every entry is different. So no two entries can have the same primary key. Now, sometimes we have multiple tables that connect to each other. In this case, we would use something called a foreign key, and that foreign key would link the two tables together. And then relationships just have to do with how each table relates to another. So, for example, a customer table and an order table, the customers can each make one or more order. Now we can go into the different types of databases. So first off, we have relational databases. So these are the major databases that deal with the major topic at hand, which is SQL. So what they are, they're kind of the basic thing that you think of when you think of a database. So just data stored in tables that sometimes connect to each other. We also have the NoSQL databases. So instead of tables, they kind of store data in other ways. So like in documents or key value pairs. So a piece of information that is identified by another piece of information. So the key and the value. So when data doesn't really fit into neat rows, so think of like unstructured data, um, then we use NoSQL databases. And then there are older types like hierarchical databases, which are more like, say, like a tree structure where one thing leads down to another and they're not really used much. So diving into SQL. So SQL is the structured query language. It's kind of the standard language we use to talk about relational databases, as mentioned earlier, and those are the most popular forms. So um, they're used kind of for SQL is kind of used for everything that has to do with databases. So think of your data, your basic data operations. So creating a table, adding information when you even want to find something. Um, so it's used as kind of like the bridge between the user and manipulating the data. Now, what makes SQL so popular? Why is it so important? Why do people use SQL databases so much? So first of all, because of the table structure, it's a lot more reliable. So if you save this information in this way, then it's very difficult for it to get mixed up or for it to even disappear. Next, it allows us to handle relationships between data. So if we have, for example, two tables and we want to know how one customer in one particular table relates to a different entry in the next table. We can connect those information easily. Thirdly, because um, they have been around for so long, they have been, SQL has been updated a lot. The features and functions are very powerful. So there are a lot of different queries and functions that can be run to basically streamline operations and make it easier to retrieve data. Um, Data integrity, once again, they are very easy to, because they're so easy to kind of manipulate the data. It's also been made possible to kind of track how changes are made. And because of that, we can easily see how, if anything has been done to the data. And then scalability, because of the table structure, it's easy to add, remove, and basically change based on business needs. Now we're gonna talk a bit more about the SQL operations. So looking at the core operations, we have the insert, select, update, and delete functions. And we can actually do a hands-on activity to look more on how these actually work. So because Microsoft Access is such a popular database tool, we can actually use this tool to do our SQL queries. So what we're going to do is we're going to open database and we're going to open Microsoft Access and we're just going to create a new database. And then in the home tab, to set up our databases, we have lots of different options. So we can do a datasheet view, which is kind of the more classic view, or we can go to create and we can do SQL queries. And then the SQL queries, they're kind of what we can use to just do everything. So first of all, we're gonna do a create query. So we're gonna say create, that's the keyword, and then we're creating a table. So create table, and then we have to give our table a name. So for example, let's do a table of students in a particular class. We're going to call the table students, and then we're going to open brackets just to kind of show where the body of our code begins and ends. So every single database, like I said, needs headings. So these headings are basically what tell you the information about each student. So what type of information would we need? First of all, and foremost is the primary key, which is the unique identifier. So normally it's something, in this case, like an ID. So let's use student ID as our primary key. So we're gonna type student ID as our name, and we have to give it a data type. So um, primary keys can be any particular data type. They just have to be unique. So in this case, we're gonna make the student ID a unique number. So let's make it an int, that stands for integer, and that is kind of the standard data type used for numbers in general. And then we're also going to declare it as the primary key. And then we use a semicolon to indicate that we finished declaring that particular variable. And then every student as well will have a first name. So it's the same concept, typing in first name as the variable name, and then the data type. So we can use this data type called the varchar. This is just for characters. So anything with letters, apostrophes, commas, just any character at all will generally use this data type. And then we can set actually the length. So just so it makes it a bit easier. So we're gonna say 50 because every student's first name should generally be within 50 characters. And then we're gonna use a comma to separate. And then we can do the same with last name. So typing in last name using this as the data type and then 50 as the length. We can use say student age and then you have integer. Like I said, that's what's used for numbers. And then let's use a GPA. So we have a GPA value, the grade point average. And even though the GPA is generally a number because it's used with a decimal point, we're going to use a different data type actually called real. And then real numbers are generally the name that SQL uses for decimals. Okay. And then once we're finished, we can go to the outside of the brackets, and then we use a semicolon to indicate that we've completed um, everything that we need to do to declare the table. And then we're going to use run to perform the query. And then you can see that the students table has actually been created here. So if we want to take a look at it, this is what it looks like. It has every one of the headings or the columns that we declared earlier, but because we didn't actually put any information in it, we didn't say any student name or any student ID, so nothing is in there quite yet. But next we're going to take a look at the how to actually insert records into the table. So we can actually save this query just to make sure that in case we want to add maybe more columns, then we can easily do that. So we can right click it, just save, and then we can save it as just create student table. And then that's the query for that. So now we're going to open a new query just to add things to the student table. So in this case, the keyword that we're using is going to be different. So it's going to be, we're going to insert. So it's going to be insert into, and because we're inserting into the students table, we just say insert into students. And then we open our bracket just to show um, that we're once again beginning the body of our code. Okay, so earlier, like I said, we have 4 or 5 columns. So we are going to need information to basically fill all of these 5 columns. So what we're going to do is we're going to say the first column we have is um first column we have is student ID, um first name, last name, and then the age and the GPA. And then the values that we're actually going to insert. We are going to say values, and then we are going to just list individually everything that we want to put in. So, for example, let's say that the first student ID is, let's say, one, because it's the first one. And then the student's first name is Bob, and we're going to put that in quotes actually because it's text. And then the last name is Brown. The age of the student is 20, and then the GPA is 3.1. And then we're going to do a semicolon, and we can run to see. Oh, we forgot the comma between the values. And then we're going to append the row. So here it tells you that we're about to do it. And then once you go into the table, it should be there. Okay, so having an issue due to a tab conversion failure, as it said. So what this generally means is that there is an issue with the data type. So let's take a better look at it. Okay, so to continue to take a look into inserting, um, let's look at inserting values into the first row of the students column. So just making up a student ID, let's use number 3. First name, let's go with John. Second is the last name, and we can say John Doe as the last name, and then the age can be 21, and then he can have a GPA of 3.4. Um, Now we have the semicolon to indicate that we're finished with that row. And then once we run, then we see, I think once we close the table and reopen it, then we can see that John Doe has been added. So it's important to always refresh the table once an entry has been added. So here we have Alice Johnson and John Doe as our two students. And so we have two entries, so we can take a look at updating. So that's modifying existing records. So once again, before we even go there, we can save this query. So we can say adding students, and then we save that. All right. So once again, we can go to the query wizard, and let's say we want to update a student's age. So the keyword is going to be update here. And then we're going to say students because that's the table. We're updating the students table. And then we are going to set the age to say where we want to update Alice's age. So she's 21 instead of 20. So we're going to set the age to 21. And then we're going to say where the primary key is equal to the primary key of the student we want to update. And that's going to be 2 because Alice Johnson's primary key or student ID is 2. And we just use the primary key because that's the best way to make sure that nobody else's record gets updated by accident because the primary key is unique. And then our semicolon to indicate that we are finished. And then it alerts us that we're about to update it. And then here we see that her age has been updated from 20 to 21. So we can save that as update table. The next thing to look at is going to be deleting unwanted records. So let's say, for example, Alice, for some reason, decides that she is no longer going to enroll in this particular school. Um, all we have to do is say delete from, and then we say students because that's our table that we're deleting from. And then we're going to specify a condition. So once again, um, we can say student ID equals to. If it was a case where maybe there were more entries in the database and you wanted to delete everybody that met a certain condition, that would be possible too. So it doesn't have to directly be, say, student ID equals 2. And then once we look at it, it just says deleted. It actually tells you that the record has been altered in some way. Um, so that's kind of an overview of basic SQL functions. Um, so that is just, I guess, the core operations of SQL. But in terms of any greater capabilities of it, you can also work on querying data, which we saw a little bit of just through working on updating those files. So, for example, what I was mentioning is, say we wish to delete everybody with a GPA under or over a certain amount. So let's say John, or let's say we want to delete people with GPAs that are less than 3.5. So we can say delete from students where GPA is less than 3.5. And then once we do that, we'd also have this record of John deleted because he fits that description. Um, Next, we have the ability to aggregate data. So what this basically means is that SQL has functions which kind of allows you to, I guess, bunch people or bunch entries by certain metrics. So think about counting the number of rows that meet certain criteria, finding the sum of an amount of rows, average, stuff like that. You can group data as well by, you know, if it's greater than or less than a particular value. And we can do subqueries and aliases, and those are a bit more advanced kind of capabilities of SQL.